I'm delivering this webinar under the banner of my organisation, Resilience Across Borders, and this is based on two key approaches. The first is to learn from positive examples. So normally when we want to try to solve a problem, we try to identify what caused the problem and then try to fix these causes so the problem won't happen again. For example, in the peace building world, there is a lot of emphasis on understanding what causes conflict and then trying to remove or reduce these causes of conflict in order to promote peace. Resilience Across Borders takes a different approach and is based on seeking to understand what really builds resilience and creates peace, and then trying to replicate these factors in order to promote peace and resilience elsewhere. So if we want to build trusting and diverse teams, let's learn from teams that are already trusting and diverse. The second approach of resilience across borders is that the components of resilience are transferable, that the approaches that a community develops to build resilience are applicable in an organisational setting and vice versa. And even if the terminology we use and the specific activities we implement are different, the concepts and approaches are transferable. We can all learn from each other. Hence, in today's webinar, we'll be looking at an example of a trusting and diverse city, the Bosnian city of Tuzla. And as I talk through this example, I invite you to consider how the beliefs, the behaviours and the actions of the people of Tuzla might be transferable to the teams or organisations or communities that you work with. So just a little bit of context. The Bosnian War, as I'm sure many of you might remember, started in April 1992 and ended with the Dayton Agreement in December 95. And it was a war that was marked by the appalling term ethnic cleansing, where civilians were forcibly moved from their homes to create ethnically pure parts of the country, as well as concentration camps, rape and sexual violence, and mass murders, including the Srebrenica genocide. And I'll come back to that right at the very end of this webinar. The city of Tuzla is located in the northeast of Bosnia-Herzegovina, not far from the border with Serbia. So it was on the front line for very much of the war. It's an industrial city with a population then of about 130,000. And it was particularly known for its salt mines. Its population was made up at the start of the war with just over 50% Muslims. Muslims is an ethnic term as well as a religious term in Bosnia. Just under 20% were Serbs, who are also Orthodox Christians, and just under 20% were Croats, who were predominantly Catholic. And then about 10% of people from mixed marriages who considered themselves Yugoslavs. And unlike most other parts of Bosnia, Tuzla remained peaceful and there was no ethnic cleansing taking place within the city. No one was made to move, no one was persecuted or murdered because of their ethnicity. And I'm going to just talk through now how it was that Tuzla was able to resist the forces of nationalism and radicalization and ethnic hatred when no other place in Bosnia was. So one aspect of this was that the city had a clear vision. The people of Tuzla had a very fierce sense of local identity, of being citizens of Tuzla. And this dated back to long before the war. So the social identity of the people living in the city was of being Tuzlan, not of their individual ethnic identity. And their vision, the mission statement, if you like, of the city was to maintain its diversity and its multi-ethnic harmony. And everyone lived by this. Everybody bought into the concept, high-profile leaders through to every citizen. And it permeated every aspect of life. It wasn't just a byproduct of life in Tuzla. It wasn't just something to be looked at once the economy and healthcare and education were sorted. Every action, everything that was said, every decision was based around achieving this as the primary goal, this vision, this identity of multi-ethnic harmony. The city had a very collaborative form of leadership. Its mayor, Mayor Bezlacic, very much walked the talk of multi-ethnic harmony. In his speeches, he started by greeting the people of Tuzla. He played to their shared social identity as Tuzlans. He didn't use the nationalistic language that was coming up elsewhere in Bosnia by calling people by their individual ethnicities. There was no them and us. And he gave people a choice. At the start of the war, he said to the city workers, the units from the Bosnian army, go if you wish. If you're not happy staying, if you want to go and fight with the Serbs, go. But if you stay on the basis that you defend our multi-ethnic city. And most stayed. He established a war cabinet. This was collective leadership with his other civil leaders in the civil administration, but also with the military leaders and with the chief of police. And he met regularly with the religious leaders from the city as well. And the leadership team were very visible. They very much sort of walked the streets. It was a bit like walking the shop floor in an organization. They were out there in amongst the people and they were listening to what people said. They were very empathetic in their style of leadership. But they were also very clear. They were very clear about the challenges they were facing. They were very clear about quashing rumors and stamping down on rumors. And they were very clear about what they wanted from the people of Tuzla, what was expected and required of them. They were expected to carry on and go to work. They were not allowed to exchange their properties, and I'll come on to why that was important in a moment. They were also very careful about their use of language, to use non-polarizing language. So, for example, they were very close to the front line and the city received shelling, a lot of shelling from Serbian forces. But the leadership were very careful not to refer to those as Serbian forces, so that they wouldn't antagonize create any antagonism, any ethnic divide against the Serbs that were living in the city. Instead, they referred to them as aggressors or Chetniks. The city had very clear policies and procedures that were very much reinforcing the city's multi-ethnic vision and identity. And these were for public institutions often around human resource policy, that all public institutions had to have and maintain a diverse and multi-ethnic workforce. And the police in particular set out to increase their ethnic diversity. The police chief recognized that at the start of the war, the police force was predominantly Muslim. So he set out to recruit more Serbs, make it more multi-ethnic. And there was very strict adherence to the rule of law throughout the war, that police were kept separate from the military. They weren't politicized. So they continued to focus on civilian rule of law, and any unacceptable behavior was dealt with. And dealt with in a very non-ethnic, non-sectarian way as well. So, for example, early on in the war, the Orthodox bishop's palace was broken into. Now, he was a Serb. And so this could have become a kind of issue of ethnicity. But in fact, it was very much treated as a normal criminal attack. Another example was that early on again in the war, when the mayor invited people to leave if they wished, some people did, particularly some Serbs. Maybe they feared the city wouldn't be able to maintain its multi-ethnic harmony throughout the war. Now, elsewhere in Bosnia, as part of ethnic cleansing, people from one ethnic group were being forcibly evicted from their properties so that people from another ethnic group could move in, and this happened in different areas. Or people chose to leave their properties because they were afraid, they were fleeing. And again, other people would move in. But this didn't happen in Tuzla. In Tuzla, no one was forcibly evicted. And if people chose to leave, their empty properties were sealed off by the authorities so that they remained empty. And it was illegal for anyone else to move into them. There was a very high level of engagement of the local population. Everyone bought into the concept of diversity and multi-ethnicity and trusting each other. Community groups were all multi-ethnic, professional bodies, sports clubs, cultural and educational associations, community groups, they were all multi-ethnic. So it's a little bit like cross-organizational working. People didn't operate in ethnic silos. And people from different ethnic groups lived amongst each other. There was no segregation of housing. So people from different groups lived as neighbors and saw each other on a regular, ongoing daily basis, just going about their normal lives. And local people would also intervene when they came across others that were using polarizing or radical or nationalistic language. They didn't just leave it to the authorities. They saw it was their own responsibility as well, a sort of shared responsibility. Now, during the war, the city tried to maintain delivery of its services and its businesses as much as possible to keep life as normal as possible. So factories and cafes tried to stay open as much as possible, and schools too tried to remain open as much as possible. When they couldn't, lessons were delivered over the radio. That might sound horribly familiar to those of you that have been homeschooling these last few months. The part of this multi-ethnic identity of Tuzla was shared by the leaders of local industry and the owners of businesses. They had some very civic-minded directors. So they not only employed people from all ethnicities, but also tried to ensure that people had access to their goods and services, people from all ethnicities, particularly during the war when there were some food shortages and it was quite hard to come by some goods. So they really thought about how their businesses could contribute to the vision of the city, the multi-ethnic social identity of the city. Events that were held, sort of cultural and sporting events, were held to celebrate the city's diversity. So there were, as I say, there were three sort of main religions in the city, and people they shared in celebrating each other's religious occasions, religious events. They all learnt the correct date and even the correct time of day when events took place, and the correct language to use to greet each other, and what food to eat. And they'd even learn how to cook each other's food and even cook together and share the food at the religious events. There were secular cultural events too throughout the war. Concerts, for example, the mayor even set up an orchestra and asked them to compose patriotic songs to keep the morale of the city up. There was a wartime Olympics during the war. And the city celebrated and reinforced positive images and experiences from their past, celebrating their diversity and their multi-ethnic identity. Whereas in other parts of Bosnia, there was a real increase in celebrating individual ethnicities, in this increasing nationalistic approach to culture of celebrating how one group had dominated another or one group had been victimized by another. The local media had a role in promoting unity. They very much spoke the language of social cohesion and inter-ethnic cooperation, and would again use their prominence to dismiss and challenge rumours rather than perpetuating them. Now, connections and relationships were important during the war, as in any kind of leadership role. So as well as working collaboratively with colleagues and other leaders in Tuzla, the Mayor Bezlacic, the mayor, also maintained relations with the president and other senior leaders in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. Although they were far more radical than him. They belonged to the Muslim party that was in power that was quite radical, and they did put pressure on him, and there was pressure on other Muslims in Tuzla as well to abandon this multi-ethnic stance and promote a more pro-Bosnian and anti-Serb stance. Now, the mayor resisted this. He stood firm by maintaining the multi-ethnic identity of the city, but he also maintained that relationship with the senior leaders in Sarajevo. These were the leaders of his country, and being part of Bosnia was important to him as well. Alongside that, he formed alliances and collaborations with moderates in opposition camps, both locally and more regionally. And at international level, he regularly wrote to the United Nations asking for support and requesting them to stop the Serb attacks on the city. He even wrote to President Clinton, urging him not to pursue the nationalist agenda as a peace plan. President Clinton was very much coordinating some of the peace talks. The mayor felt that this nationalist agenda would destroy Bosnia. So on the one hand, he was writing letters to the leader of the free world, and on the other hand, he was still walking the streets of the city of Tuzla and talking to and listening to his local citizens. So all of this activity, all of these factors were in place to try and maintain peace and promote this multi-ethnic identity and cohesion. But the people of Tuzla couldn't completely prevent the war and the radical nationalist agenda from entering Tuzla, but they could determine how they responded. So, for example, quite early on in the war, one of the Orthodox churches in Tuzla was badly damaged by a shell from the Serbian forces outside. And the mayor immediately called on workers from all of the workers who were working across the city to come and help repair the church. He said, this church belongs to all of the citizens of Tuzla, and we cannot allow anyone from outside to destroy it. So in other words, this wasn't something that just affected part of Tuzlan society. If it affected some people from the city, it affected everyone. And the workers of all ethnicities did come and met the mayor's request and worked round the clock to repair the church. Although, as I say, most of the local media sought to maintain this vision, this multi-ethnic identity, early on in the war, a Muslim nationalist newspaper was set up called Samaj, and this received a lot of support from the radical Muslims elsewhere, particularly from Sarajevo. And again, there was a lot of pressure to promote this pro-Muslim, anti-Serb rhetoric. But other local newspapers responded, publishing letters and articles from citizens who were speaking out against this radicalization. And this was galvanizing support amongst civil society. Graffiti appeared around the city, promoting this multi-ethnic identity. Nowadays, there'd probably be a lot happening on social media. And a civil society group was formed at this time called the Forum of Tuzla Citizens, specifically to promote this unity. And it included a range of prominent high-profile figures as well as ordinary citizens. And it reached a membership of 15,000, so more than 10% of the population of the people of Tuzla, so quite incredible. And the authorities, some of them have been maybe buckling a little bit under the pressure of this rising radicalization, were maybe reminded or realized how strong the citizens of Tuzla felt about maintaining their multi-ethnic harmony, how important that vision was, that maintaining that diversity was to the city. And they stamped down on the Samaj newspaper and the radical Muslim voices in the city. Now, during the war, Tuzla became known as a safe haven. It became known as a place where there was no ethnic cleansing. And as such, it received a lot of displaced people from elsewhere in the country, particularly Muslims who had suffered or maybe been expelled by Serbian forces elsewhere. So understandably, some of them came with some strong anti-Serb sentiment. And the authorities and the people of Tuzla made it very clear that the displaced people were welcome. And the displaced people received support from Tuzlans of all ethnicities and were given roofs over their heads, food to eat. But radicalization and divisive language and acts of revenge were not tolerated. So people were welcome to stay, provided they bought into that multi-ethnic identity of the city. And if they didn't buy into that, they could leave, and some did. And a very sad day for Tuzlans was towards the end of the war in May 95, when 71 young people were killed and 240 others injured by shelling in the city centre at a spot where typically young people and young teenagers would gather. Now, the young people were from all ethnicities. And very quickly, the mayor and the parents of those 71 young people killed and the religious leaders got together and decided that these young people would all be buried together, regardless of religious or ethnic background. They'd lived together, they'd played together, they'd died together, they would be buried together. And the funeral was not well publicized, and it was held at 4 a.m. so as not to attract the attention of any further attacks from the Serb forces. But even so, several thousand Tuzlans turned up and attended the ceremony, a ceremony that was jointly led by leaders from all three religions. So I hope that this has given a flavour of the range of factors that enabled Tuzla to maintain its diverse multi-ethnic identity and values in spite of enormous pressures to do otherwise. And that it has demonstrated that there was no one factor, no single intervention that enabled this to happen, but it was because of a contribution of factors. The city had a clear vision, It was a vision that everyone in the city felt connected to and responsible for. There are procedures and policies to implement the vision, and a range of activities that embedded and reinforced this vision on a day-to-day basis. And it was all of this that meant that when there were threats to this vision, to their shared diverse social identity, and when the trust between the ethnic groups was under threat, the city was able to overcome these risks and to retain or even enhance its diverse multi-ethnic identity. And although everybody in the city was involved, from the civic authorities and religious leaders, businesses, industry, media, community groups, ordinary people of Tuzla, everybody played a role, there is no doubt that the leadership of Mayor Bezlacic was key to all of this. And I'm pleased to say that he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't win it, but he was nominated for it.